Should be live now. Says we're live, so I hope we're live.
All right.
I always like to double check here, so let's. I'm gonna go just to confirm before we get started, and plus give people a minute or two to catch up. It always.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Oh yeah, it says we're live. I think we're good to go. All right. Yes, we are live. Good. Wonderful. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. This is Travis Shaw from the Mosby Heritage Area Association, coming to you with another in our Live at 5 video series. Every Friday at 5 p.m., we explore a local history topic with a local history expert. I'm very excited about today's program. Our guest today is someone that most of you should know if you've been around the Mosby Heritage area for a while, and that is Kevin Pawlak. Kevin is a MHAA alum. He was the Director of Education at MHAA for several years, and certainly a great coworker. I have to say, I always enjoyed working with you, Kevin.
Well, the feeling's definitely mutual.
But Kevin has since gone on to Prince William County, was it Department of Historic Resources, Division of Historic Resources?
Yeah, Historic Preservation Division.
Okay, Historic Preservation Division, where he serves as a site manager at two of Prince William County's most probably well-known historic sites, those being the Ben Lomond Historic House and Bristow Station Battlefield. So, Kevin, I'm gonna let you kind of take it from here. Let's start talking about Ben Lomond. Of the two sites, it's actually the one I'm ashamed to admit I've never visited. So give me a basic intro to Ben Lomond. Where is it? When was it built? Who lived there? Kind of the basic facts. We'll start from there.
So Ben Lomond sits right in the middle of suburbia Manassas right now. But of course, at the time that it was first built, in 1832, it was really a farm of roughly about 1,000 acres when it was constructed in 1832. And really, Ben Lomond's history goes back a little ways before that. So now that I've got the house built for you in 1832, I want to take it back. Earlier than that, it was known as Cancer Plantation, and it was once part of a roughly 6,000 acre plantation that was owned by the Carter family. Of course, a very prominent family here in Northern Virginia. They owned somewhere in the ballpark of 65,000 acres of land, well over a dozen different plantations that they owned. And so Cancer Plantation here, that would become known as Ben Lomond, was actually their second cancer plantation. And of course, the name is, go ahead.
I was just going to say, we might have to explain the name there.
Yeah, the name is obviously rather unique. It turns quite a few heads when we mention that to people, and obviously it's not quite as an attractive name as Ben Lomond is. But the Carter family named all of their plantations after zodiac signs. So they just went down the list basically, and the property there along Bull Run just happened to be Cancer Plantation.
Yeah, I think Sagittarius was not too far away, somewhere further up Bull Run, maybe, or one of the other signs.
Yeah, there was Leo was not too far away. Yep. There was another one, Leo, and I think those were there's probably another one I'm missing. But of course, the Carter family has great connections in Loudon, of course, with Oatlands, and several other places. But Robert Carter III's real claim to fame is in 1791, his deed of manumission, which he issued, that was really certainly a progressive document by its time in 1791, and a document that worried a lot of Virginians and Southerners as well throughout the United States, the very young United States at that point. But it was a document to free just under 500 of Carter's slaves, and some of those, it was progressive. It wasn't all at once. It was sort of incremental over the years. But some of the first slaves that were to be freed by Carter's deed of manumission were enslaved at the Cancer Plantation here in what's now Manassas. So when Carter dies, the family, the land at Ben Lomond passes down through the family. It comes to a grandson of his by the name of Benjamin Tasker Chin. And when Chin gets possession of the property, you've some of you might be familiar with the Chin name. It's Chin with two N's on it. So there is a connection to Manassas National Battlefield there.
I say, as a Marylander, well acquainted with the Taskers as well.
Yes.
Very huge landowning family up my way. So.
Okay, yeah. So clearly, Benjamin Tasker Chin is coming from a family of landowners. But when he gets the property at Ben Lomond, he's very much land rich but cash poor, as we like to say. So he owns a lot of property, but he doesn't necessarily have enough wealth to amass. And so when he gets possession of the property in 1830, it takes him 2 years to finally get a house built. And the house that he does construct is what you will see today and be able to get a tour of at Ben Lomond. And that's the house that was built in 1832. It was really a bachelor pad, if you will, for Chin. Originally, he wouldn't get married until 5 years later, married to a cousin of his by the name of Edmonia Carter. And according to Carter family tradition, when Edmonia moved in, she hated the name Cancer for the plantation. You can only wonder why. And so she named it Ben Lomond, which a lot of people will come to the site, and their first question is, who is Ben Lomond? And Ben Lomond is not a person. It is a Scottish term instead that means Beacon Mountain. And it was a name that Edmonia and the Carter family knew well, as there was another Ben Lomond here in Virginia. So they just sort of transferred the name to this spot. But it was very fitting. It's tough to really see today because Ben Lomond is, again, surrounded by suburbia. The farm that once stood 6,000 acres is now about 6 acres that the county owns and operates. But it does stand up on top of a pretty prominent hill, and so it would make sense as a beacon mountain, if you will, in suburbia Virginia. Well, now in suburbia Virginia, that is, not at the time.
Yeah, that was actually something I was going to ask is, if you're a visitor coming to see Ben Lomond here in 2020, what do you expect to see when you come to your site?
Yeah, so we have 5 historic buildings on site. We have the main house. We have the original dairy and smokehouse, which also would have been built roughly about the same time as the house in 1832. We have one of 3 still standing original slave quarters in Prince William County. It's the only one that's open to the public on a regular basis. So we're very fortunate to be able to have that and to be able to tell the story of the enslaved, not just at Ben Lomond, but throughout Prince William County as a whole. And then we have a 5th building that's a bit of a mystery to us. We're just starting to do some work with it, but one part of the building is log in the back, and we think that it might actually predate the stone house. Not the stone house at Manassas National Battlefield, but the main house on the Ben Lomond property. So we're starting to dig in and do some research into that building as well. But those 4 of the 5 buildings, the one that we're starting to research is not yet open to the public. But the smokehouse, dairy are open, the slave quarters is open for tours, and then the main house is as well.
Fantastic. Now, being located so close to Manassas, I'm sure the house played a role in some way, shape, or form with the 2 battles that happened there. And I know you're a Civil War guy, so walk us through the Civil War connection at Ben Lomond.
Yeah, the Civil War connection is really quite interesting. And for as many answers as we probably have about what happened at Ben Lomond from 1861 to 1865, I would argue that we have just as many questions, and I'll get into that a little bit. But the Chins continued to own the property when the war began in 1861, though they no longer lived there. By that point, they had moved up to Hazel Plain, which sits today sat where the Chin Ridge tour stop is at Manassas National Battlefield. So the Chins, at least their property was right in the midst of both battles in July 1861 and August of 1862. And then their property, by extension there at Ben Lomond, would also find itself in the midst of not so much action, but certainly in the midst of the wider impact of the Battle of First Manassas in July of 61. The family living there was a family of Scottish immigrants by the name of the Pringles. There were just 3 men, a father and 2 sons, that were there on July 21st of 1861. But what ended up happening is that Ben Lomond was situated behind Confederate lines. And while most of the Confederate Army was positioned closer to Manassas Junction than where the battle ended up being fought, as the sounds of battle picked up on the morning of July 21st, and Confederate troops began shuttling their way north towards the area of the Stone Bridge, Matthews Hill, and Henry House Hill. The road that most of those Confederate units took went right past Ben Lomond, and in fact, we do still have traces of that road on the property today. So some of the more famous troops to have taken that road are the Virginia regiments under the command of Thomas Jonathan Jackson, of course, soon to be christened Stonewall Jackson, and a lot of the wounded Confederate soldiers that would find their way back to Ben Lomond were soldiers of the Stonewall Brigade. But not all of them, but most of them were. So at some point during the battle, Confederate surgeons took possession of the Pringle House and converted it into a hospital. That and the grounds. They gave the Pringles really two options, and those options were either the Pringle family could gather up all their personal belongings as quickly as they possibly could and get out and turn the entire house and grounds over to the Confederate Army, or the Pringles could remain in the house but have their living quarters confined to just one small room. And ultimately, the Pringles made the decision to stay in the house while it was being utilized as a Confederate field hospital. Now, at the time, most of the Confederate field hospitals, or most hospitals, were situated outside. But with the weather the way it was the night of July 21st, with thunder, lightning, and rain, everything had to be moved inside the house. And that includes waiting room, really, surgery room, and a recovery room, if you will, to put it into modern terms. The house was completely filled with wounded soldiers. And that's one of the greatest questions that I have, and a lot of our visitors have, is just how many wounded are we talking about? And unfortunately, there is no answer that we have found to that. We have been able to identify some of the soldiers that were hospitalized there at Ben Lomond, and just, cookies and crumbs of historical research, but we've never found the holy grail of that list of names of who exactly was hospitalized at the Pringle House Hospital.
Yeah, I mean, we're so used to hearing these horror stories about what these, temporary field hospitals looked like, amputations, gunshot wounds, and everything. Obviously, the surgeries available aren't necessarily what we're used to nowadays. Are there any firsthand accounts from soldiers who either were treated there, or surgeons, people working in the house, that relate directly to Ben Lomond?
Yeah, there are a couple. The best source that we have is Edward Craighill's memoirs, which he published years after the war, but nonetheless are a really good source, firsthand account of what he saw at the Pringle House Hospital as it came to be known. Craighill was a very young man, not even 21 years old at the time of the battle, and never forgot. You can just really read, when you read his words, you can tell how much of an impression it left on him. But he describes the overall picture of the Pringle House Hospital and what it was like, but he also shares quite a few personal stories of some of the soldiers that he remembered that were there. And I think the most poignant piece that Craighill talks about is the night of July 21st, after having helped surgeons all day, hour after hour, with countless surgeries. He received a bit of a reprieve, a break, if you will, and he went to go look for a place to lie down and grab a few hours of rest. And he said there was no place in the entire house for a well man to rest. So he had to go outside into the rain, sleep underneath a tree. He slept between two Confederate soldiers that presumably had been wounded and were not able to find space in the house either, and so were left outside to wait in the rain. And when Craighill woke up the next morning, both of those Confederate soldiers on either side of him had died. And he spent the rest of his life wondering if they had died during the night while he was sleeping between them, or if they had already been dead when he went out there. Another source that we have, and maybe the most famous patient, if you will, that was there is William Fitzhugh Lee. He was appointed Lieutenant Colonel of the 33rd Virginia Infantry. Lee received a very serious wound in the chest, right on Henry Hill, somewhere in the vicinity of the visitor center parking lot, roughly, on the battlefield. And Lee was transported back to the Pringle House Hospital. He lingered there for 8 days and ultimately died, not so much from his wounds, but from disease that his wound had contracted, which was gangrene, a very common ailment that you would find in Civil War hospitals. And several of Lee's family members came down, traveled from Shepherdstown, which is where the area where Lee's wife was from, Lily Parr and Lee. And so we have several accounts from the Lee family and other Shepherdstown residents talking about coming down to Ben Lomond. And again, in those letters, they mention little anecdotes about other soldiers that were there. So we've been able to compile a roster of probably about 12 to 15 soldiers that we can positively identify as being there at Ben Lomond.
Great. We actually have a question for you online. Someone is asking, have they discovered any graffiti in the house from any of the wounded soldiers?
There is plenty of graffiti, but whether or not it's from the wounded soldiers is up for debate. The graffiti that exists in the house today, much of it has been covered by a special conservative wallpaper in order to protect it. When the county got possession of the house in the early 1980s, much of the graffiti had been exposed. It wouldn't be really examined until the early 2000s, and so much of it had faded, unfortunately, by that point. So a lot of it was covered up. But before it was recorded, and from some of the transcriptions that the early researchers conducted of the graffiti there on the walls of the house, it does seem possible that there may have been some Confederate soldiers that did graffiti the house. There are potential soldiers that we have from Virginia, of course, and other Confederate states, but most of the graffiti that we've been able to identify, the bearers of the signature, are Union soldiers instead. And that represents a whole different fold to the history of Ben Lomond later on in the war.
Okay, yeah, I was actually going to ask, were any Federal soldiers after the Battle of First Manassas treated there, or was it strictly a Confederate hospital?
It was strictly a Confederate hospital. Throughout the winter of 1861, the Pringle family continued to live there. It was, for a time, Edmund Kirby Smith's headquarters during the winter of 61. The 19th Mississippi built winter huts on the property as well. And then in the spring of 62, it was converted once again into a hospital, this time probably more for disease patients than battle wounded. But almost immediately after Joseph Johnston pulls his army out of Northern Virginia to move closer to Richmond, Union cavalry begins to visit the Pringle house. It seems that there had been some information that reached Union lines outside of Washington that the Pringles were Confederate sympathizers. There had been rumors that they were storing goods for the Confederate Army, uniforms, firearms, things like that, in a store that they held on the property. And so many Union soldiers came to visit. And thankfully, the Pringles, Thomas Pringle, one of the sons in the 1870s, because they were not American citizens, they were British subjects, they were able to apply for damage reparations done to their property through the Treaty of Washington. And so they gave an itemized list of every single time Union soldiers came to visit Ben Lomond and what they took. And, in some cases, they even write down what regiments came by, again, what they took, how many damages, or how much the damages cost to the Pringle family. And that's probably when the Union graffiti was written on the walls there of the house. We can only, unfortunately, positively identify two soldiers that were there. One is James Mooney from the 1st Pennsylvania Reserves. We know from the Pringle documentation, the Pringle claims that the Pennsylvania Reserves showed up on April 11th, 1862. They took a mahogany table, a dresser, a few other pieces of furniture, probably chopped them up and turned them into firewood rather than converting them into furniture in their camps. But it's probably at that time that Mooney signed his name on the walls of the house. And then upstairs in the second story landing of the house, we've been able to identify another name, and that's William Wallace Cranston of the 66th Ohio Infantry, who incredibly enough was actually a Medal of Honor recipient for an act he performed more than likely after he signed his name on the walls there at Ben Lomond, and that was at the Battle of Chancellorsville.
Wow, cool. Not to take this too far afield, but it's such an interesting wrinkle of history that, because as a British subject, he was able to file for these reparations. And that's in large part due to another heritage area figure, Thomas Balch, who the Thomas Balch Library in Leesburg is named after, the father of international arbitration for the the agreements that he was able to work out between America and Britain. So, it's amazing we have such a small area, but all of these kind of webs of history tied together.
Yeah, this is the crossroads of history. A lot really comes together right here in Northern Virginia, that's for sure.
We have another question online. Somebody just asked, what secondary or tertiary hospitals were the Confederate wounded sent to for further care, and how were they sent there?
Yeah, so the Pringle House Hospital was only a hospital for 35 days. It lasted from July 21st until the last soldiers to be treated there were on August 25th of 1861. But by that point, the Confederate wounded, the seriously wounded that could be transported were transported by rail. Of course, that's one of the reasons that the Confederate Army was even up here protecting the Manassas Rail Junction in the first place. And they were transported by rail in some cases as far away as Richmond. Charlottesville was another hospital depot that had been established at that point. A little bit closer to home, Warrenton became a hospital town as well. And then we do know, ironically, kind of a neat connection. One of the Confederate soldiers that was treated at the Pringle House Hospital, John Rose, from the 2nd Mississippi, was transported to Camp Jones, which exists or was where basically Bristow Station battlefield is today. And so he actually died at Camp Jones. So we have a neat little link between, where Confederates from the Pringle House Hospital might have gone afterwards.
Very cool. So you've taken us up kind of through the spring of 1862. Obviously, we have the massive, much larger Battle of Second Manassas that occurs in August of 1862. What's the impact on the Pringle House during that battle?
That is an excellent question. The last thing that the Pringles record as happening to their property damage that they lost in their claims is August 28th, 1862, which is the first day of the Battle of Second Manassas, the fighting there at Bronner Farm. And they record that they had one horse-drawn wagon taken from them. And that's it. Unfortunately, they don't say which regiment took it at all, but we just don't know what the situation was like at the Pringle House by that point in August of 1862. I would have to imagine much of the Union Army that marched past it on Sudley Road, not too far away, would have, maybe stragglers, skulkers might have gone there to visit the house. But in terms of its use as a hospital, there is no indication that the Federals or Confederates used it in the aftermath of Second Manassas. It's entirely possible, but we just can't say for sure, unfortunately.
What about the post-war history of the house? What eventually happens to the Pringles, and where does the house go from there?
Yeah, so the last indication we have is that Andrew Pringle Sr., the father, dies at the age of 82. He dies on January 25th of 1863 at the Pringle, or at Ben Lomond. And then where do the Pringles go from there, at least for the rest of the war, is unclear. I think they probably leave the house vacant, but that's just an educated guess, nothing more than that. But they do come back for a time after the war, and then ultimately Benjamin Tasker Chin will sell the property in 1870. He basically does a land swap for some land in Washington, D.C. Goes through a couple of different owners. Eventually it will pass into the Rixey family. One of the members of the Rixey family, very interesting man. He was a surgeon on the staff of the United States presidents. He was actually present as a surgeon at William McKinley's assassination in Buffalo in 1901. And then because he owned Ben Lomond during the time that he was surgeon for Theodore Roosevelt, we know that President Roosevelt rode out to Manassas on several occasions for hunting and to visit the old Manassas battlefield. And he did stay at the house on at least one occasion that we can positively identify, but probably more than that. Then passing through several other families into the 1920s and 1930s, it became a very large and prosperous dairy farm. There was actually a large barn that was built across the street that no longer stands. It was taken down sometime in the mid-1970s. It's where, for those of you familiar with Manassas, the Pat White Center at Ben Lomond actually is built to look like the old barn, and it's built on the same spot. but the silo is really the only thing that's left of the dairy operation, and that still stands tucked away behind the Pat White Center. But then it came into the county's hands in 1981. It went through really not several different hands, but several different components of county government. And then ultimately it was opened up full-time as a museum site in 2011. And I thankfully stumbled into it. I can't take the credit for the exhibits that were put in, because by the time I came in, they were well established, but they really are unique exhibits. It's a lot of, when visitors come, we encourage them to really immerse themselves in the history. So we have sounds and audio throughout the house. It's depicted as the house might have been, as our interpretation is, of what it might have been like the night of July 21st, 1861. So you have the sound of surgeons rushing up and down the stairs, soldiers screaming for help, surgeons talking to each other. We have different smell machines as well to try and create this smell of what a hospital, just a tiny fraction of what a hospital might have been like. Most of basically everything original, all the original furniture had been stripped from the house. And so a lot of it is reproduction. So we encourage visitors to try on uniforms. They can sit down on the cots if they like. We have poster board on some of the walls so they can write their names. They can graffiti the walls of Ben Lomond if they like. So it's really a unique visitor experience. And then in the slave quarters outside, we've just added late last year a new virtual reality program that, through the eyes of one of the enslaved that we know lived at Ben Lomond for a year. She was actually rented out to the Pringles. Her name was Rachel. We tell the story of just basically what daily life was like for the enslaved at Ben Lomond.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up. I was going to ask, you guys have such a reputation for being really on the cutting edge of kind of immersive kind of storytelling history there. What was the process of that virtual reality? Like, how did you go about getting this virtual reality set up there at Historic Site?
A lot of it was knowing the right people. From my time with Mosby Heritage Area and a few other organizations, I came to know Jonathan Noyalis, who's now director of the McCormick Civil War Center at
last week, actually.
Okay, yes, yeah, there you go. That's right. Yep. And I knew that Jonathan had been working to get virtual reality at the Cool Spring Battlefield, and then he was also instrumental in doing the John Brown's Trial virtual program at the old courthouse there in Winchester. And so we had this idea of really, we felt that the house had a lot of the technology, had a lot of the interpretation and creativity pumped into it, and the slave quarters not so much. The slave quarters was sort of I say old school model of interpretation, in the sense that when visitors go into it, they hear the story from a guided interpreter. They can still interact with the furniture that's there, but there's no really technology to spice it up, if you will. So we got in touch with Shenandoah University and their Center for Immersive Studies. Worked with JJ Rosella, their executive director there, and we were able to work something out. Thankfully, JJ had an actress in mind that he wanted to use. We had a real person from Ben Lomond's history that we thought would be a perfect window into the life of the enslaved. And so we drafted up a script very quickly, tried to make it as accurate and as tasteful as possible, to try to appeal to all different ages. And then JJ brought his team out, and for one night we were there from probably 6 o'clock at night until just after midnight, filming, doing shot after shot. But it was a lot of fun. It was really a quick whirlwind of putting it all together, but we were really happy with how it turned out. And can't wait to share it with our visitors.
That sounds so fascinating. Before all this stuff kind of went down, we had been talking about coming out to get a look at it. So I'm really looking forward to the opportunity to see that.
Yeah, we're excited to have you out, and when all this clears up, then we'll be more than happy to bring you out there.
Great. Well, I want to shift gears now to the second site that you manage, and that is the Bristow Station Battlefield. Again, kind of orient us geographically. Where is it in relation to Ben Lomond? And talk a little bit about the significance of this site.
Yeah, so Bristow Station is down the railroad tracks from Manassas Junction. It's about 4 or 5 miles southwest of the modern city of Manassas today. And Bristow Station, or Bristow itself, is really just a large suburban community in the suburbs of Washington. But Bristow Station at the time of the Civil War was just a small station, another stop on the Orange and Alexandria Railroad. And it's really that railroad, that lifeline mostly for the Union Army during the war, that's going to bring the war to Bristow Station on multiple occasions. And really, there's probably hardly a day that goes by when the civilians, those that stuck it out and stuck around Bristow Station during the course of the war, saw either a blue jacket or a gray jacket of a soldier marching past. But obviously, being behind Confederate lines in 1861, Bristow Station was first occupied by the Confederate Army. Shortly following the Battle of First Manassas in early September, Camp Jones was established around a natural spring, and then it also made sense because the railroad was there. It was easy to supply Confederate troops there. But Camp Jones quickly, like most Civil War camps, became a disease-ridden area for those Confederate troops to be in. Troops from all across the South were there, but it's really a sad story there at Camp Jones of just how much disease ran through a lot of the regiments that were there. And one soldier, the 10th Alabama, the regiment we talk about the most at Camp Jones, and I'll explain why in a second, mentioned that hardly a day went by when you didn't hear several volleys of musketry at Camp Jones, and that wasn't because of battle, but it was because of military burials that were taking place there. So we do know that there were several cemeteries located in the area of Bristow Station from Camp Jones. Unfortunately, the only one that has been marked and positively identified is the cemetery to the 10th Alabama, where we've been able to identify 82 different grave shafts, 41 names that are there, but unfortunately, pretty much all of the grave markers are long gone, so we don't know where each person is necessarily buried. But most of those 10th Alabama casualties are casualties of disease. We do know that a few casualties from the Battle of Drainsville in December of 1861 are buried there as well. But the story of Camp Jones is really, it's kind of nice at Bristow Station because I think the two of the main military stories that are often told when it comes to the American Civil War is, of course, the battles. And at Bristow Station, we have two major battles that take place, but then also camp life. And there are multiple encampments, as I mentioned, throughout the war that occur at Bristow Station.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy for us to lose track of the fact that 90% of the soldier's life in the Civil War was not spent in battle or anything like that. It's spent in camp, it's spent marching. And, a huge part of that, of course, is the logistics. And you mentioned the importance of the rail line to Bristow. That's why the armies are there. That's why these battles are occurring. So a little bit about the battles, I'm completely in the dark here, so tell me.
Okay, well, you've led me into a perfect segue with talking about the railroad. The first major battle to take place at Bristow Station is August 26th and 27th of 1862. That just to avoid getting confused with the later Battle of Bristow Station, we refer to at the park as the Battle of Kettle Run, named for a stream that runs just southwest of the park, the current park boundary. But by August of 1862, the theater of, or the seat of war in the Eastern Theater has been transferred from outside of Richmond, where, of course, Robert E. Lee and his Confederate Army have turned back the Union Army's attempt to capture the Confederate capital there at Richmond. A second Union Army under the command of John Pope, the Army of Virginia, is sent on the overland route roughly from Washington down to Richmond to try and take Richmond from that perspective, from that direction, and also try to save the Union Army of the Potomac under George McClellan down there. And what ends up happening is the Lincoln administration decides to pull McClellan's army off the Virginia Peninsula, ship it back up to Northern Virginia, combine the two armies is the idea, and then advance overland towards Richmond with overwhelming force. So Lee knows that he has just a small window of time before those two Union armies unite, and Lee's going to be ultimately outnumbered. And so he moves very quickly to attack and strike John Pope. Initially, John Pope does a very good job of parrying Lee's different offensive thrusts, but ultimately Lee is going to send about 24,000 men under the command of Stonewall Jackson on a 54-mile march around Pope's army. And Jackson's intent is to cut John Pope's supply line, but also the line, the rail line that is being used to reinforce Pope's army from those arriving units of the Army of the Potomac, and that's the Orange and Alexandria Railroad. So on the evening of August 26th, Jackson's men arrive just before dusk on that evening, and they are able to wreck 2 locomotives and 24 train cars that had been stacked up on the tracks behind those wrecked locomotives. One of the cars, or the trains that is attacked by the Confederates, is known as the President, and it carried a picture of Abraham Lincoln right on the front of that locomotive there. And as it was steaming through Bristow Station, Confederate troops took shots at it. And as they noted afterwards, apparently, they said one of the bullets had passed right through the forehead of that portrait of Abraham Lincoln there on the front of the locomotive. Whether that's true or just a little bit of embellishment after the war, who knows exactly. But
maybe a little bit of foreshadowing. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly right. I'm sure that was factored into their storytelling nonetheless. But John Pope realizes he's caught completely by surprise about what Lee has done to him. And now Pope decides to focus all of his attention on Jackson's part of the Confederate Army, forgetting Lee and Longstreet are still maneuvering down along the banks of the Rappahannock River. And so Pope is going to start moving his army in the direction of Gainesville and the old Manassas battlefield. But he also has to open up his supply line there at Bristow Station. And so on the morning of August 27th, he will dispatch one regiment, the 72nd New York Infantry, down the rail line. They get within a few hundred yards of Bristow Station just as the sun is rising. They can see through the light being emitted from those burning rail cars of the previous evening that the Confederates are moving to try and cut them off. So the 72nd will pull all the way back to Kettle Run. They call for help, and about 7,000 Union soldiers under the command of Joseph Hooker will arrive to fight Stonewall Jackson's rear guard there at Bristow Station, which is under the command of somebody who grew up not too far away from Bristow Station, General Richard Ewell. And Ewell is basically told to protect Jackson's men while the rest of Jackson's soldiers are raiding the Federal Supply Depot at Manassas Junction. This is a very famous instance in the Civil War when, Jackson's men, they find lobster, they find candy, they find
canned oysters and
oysters,
kinds of booze and tobacco and all the good stuff that they've been missing out on, right?
Yeah, you name it. Basically, every Confederate soldier that was there wrote about it in some fashion of just how much stuff they were able to seize from this Federal Supply Depot. So while Jackson's men are getting fat on that, Ewell is left behind at Bristow Station to protect them in the meantime. And that's what's going on.
I think I recall some account of like being able to smell burning bacon for miles from these stores that were being torched. Basically anything that couldn't be carried off.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I'm sure that was absolutely the case. I don't think I've seen that source, but it would not surprise me at all. Again, they just captured all sorts of stuff that had to have been absolute delicacies to these guys that they probably hadn't seen since they enlisted in the Confederate Army. In many cases over a year before. Yeah. But while they're sacking Manassas Junction, Hooker is going to attack at Ewell's lines outside of Bristow Station. Pretty short fight, only a couple of hours long, but a very sharp fight. Nonetheless, leads to about 600 casualties. A couple of Union regiments will suffer over 50% casualties in the Excelsior Brigade, very famous brigade, originally led by Dan Sickles. But unfortunately, at least for us, Dan Sickles was not present at the Battle of Kettle Run. Of course, Sickles, for better or worse, he attracts visitors. But eventually what's going to happen is Ewell is going to start to feel the weight of federal pressure, and he will begin preparations to withdraw. But he's obviously a little leery about this because if you withdraw without receiving word from Stonewall Jackson to do so, you're probably going to have a court-martial leveled against you. But fortunately for Ewell, just as he starts to begin those preparations to withdraw, he gets an order from Jackson not to bring on a general engagement. And if that is the case, to fall back to Manassas Junction and rejoin the rest of Jackson's command. So John Pope, the Union Army commander, rides up in the aftermath of the Battle of Kettle Run. He sees the 600 casualties laying there on the battlefield, but he realizes he sees what he wants to see. He sees the Confederate Army is falling back. He sees his Union soldiers victorious. And so it's the next morning that Pope is going to really focus on, as he says to one of his subordinate officers, he says, "We shall bag the whole crowd." And he has tunnel vision, sets his sights on going after Stonewall Jackson's command the next day, August 28th. And of course, that is ultimately going to be Pope's undoing when he confronts Jackson on the Manassas battlefield. So, go ahead.
I was going to say, okay. So I know we're getting a little short on time here, but I did want to give you a chance to talk about the second battle that happens there. Now it's what, just a little over a year later?
Correct. Yep.
Yep.
Yeah, October 14th, 1863. Lee basically put it in a nutshell. He tries to do the same exact thing that he does to Pope in 1862. He's trying to do this to George Meade, trying to get between Meade and Washington, put Meade in the Union Army in a position where Lee can at least deal a significant enough blow. Also, Lee's trying to affect the northern elections that are taking place in the fall of 1863. He's making sure that more Union troops aren't sent out west to help the beleaguered Union garrison at Chattanooga, Tennessee. And really, it's going to be another Union victory at Bristow Station. The Confederates are going to catch the Second Army Corps as it's moving along the Orange and Alexandria Railroad in the direction of Centerville. The Second Corps and elements of A.P. Hill's Confederate Third Corps are going to run into each other. One of Hill's division commanders, Henry Heath, who's of course very familiar to Gettysburg, aficionados, is essentially going to repeat what he does on July 1st, not put much of a reconnaissance in place, and really there wasn't much cavalry for him to do so. But he sends 2 North Carolina brigades against the Union troops that are huddled behind the railroad embankment. And when the fighting clears up on October 14th, it is a terrible Confederate defeat, about 1,400 Confederate casualties as compared to about 400 Union casualties. Also, the Confederates will lose 5 artillery pieces captured by the Federals. But ultimately, the Federals will be able to escape their positions there at Bristow Station, get back into the defenses around Centerville, and Lee's hope for dealing a decisive blow to at least a part of the Army of the Potomac vanishes right there and then. And so he has to pull his army back to the Rappahannock River within a couple of days.
Now, to me, this is such a fascinating phase of the Civil War, at least in terms of military history, because, I'm not a Civil War expert by any stretch, but, I feel like, the Battle of Gettysburg occurs in July. And then, kind of the narrative of the Eastern Theater is like, well, like nothing big happens until the following spring in the Overland Campaign. But what we really see is in the fall of 1863, there's a tremendous amount of maneuvering and a tremendous amount of fighting going on. And so, this, I guess, would be a part of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't know if you can speak to kind of the general picture of what's going on then, because it's something I'd love to learn a little bit more about.
Yeah, very much you read a lot of general histories of the war, and you're absolutely right. Basically, Gettysburg happens July of 1863. Lee gets back across the Potomac River. Grant is sent east in the early spring of 1864, and then the Battle of the Wilderness happens, and the Overland Campaign happens, and that's it. But in reality, there's a lot of really interesting maneuvering, some sharp but small actions that take place between the Army of Northern Virginia and Army of the Potomac in that time period. And the Bristow Station campaign is really Robert E. Lee's last offensive campaign of the Civil War. Of course, you're going to have Jubal Early's raid into Maryland in 1864, but Lee is sort of orchestrating that, but he's not right there with that Confederate force. And so this is Lee's last offensive, and it's going to be the farthest north that an army led by Robert E. Lee is going to get, the closest it's going to get to Washington for the rest of the war. Again, excepting Jubal Early's troops outside of Washington in 1864. But this is, if you want to take stock of what you think of George Meade as an Army commander as well, this is a perfect time period to do it. This is 2 campaigns, the Bristow Station campaign, and then later on in November and December, the Mine Run campaign are going to be 2 campaigns where Meade he starts as the campaign as the Army of the Potomac's commander. He ends it. He's pulling all the strings. And of course, he doesn't have, as he will during the 1864 Overland campaign, Ulysses S. Grant hovering over his shoulder and dictating a lot of the actions.
It's a fascinating part of the war that, like I said, I'd love to learn more about. So if I wanted to come learn more about the battles at Bristow Station, again, like I asked about Ben Lomond, if I'm visiting, what can I expect to see?
Well, we have 140 acres right now, park. There's about 3 miles of walking trails. So it's very much self-guided during the summer months and the second and fourth months, second and fourth weekends of each month. May through October, we do have guided tours as well. If you're interested, under normal times, we have guided tours, but it's very, self-guided. As I mentioned, we have what we call the 1861-1862 trail, which is going to take you through woodlots and through open fields, and that covers the story of Camp Jones. It will carry you out to the 10th Alabama Cemetery, and then out to the 1862 Kettle Run battlefield. And then we have an 1863 trail that will put you in the footsteps of the Confederate advances towards the railroad embankment on October 14th, 1863. So plenty of nature as well. You don't have to be a history buff to come out and enjoy the trails at Bristow Station. We do have a reconstructed winter quarters as well, that something like what the Federals would have built when they camped there in the winter of 63, 64. And then we are slowly starting to put together, really, if you will, I guess you could call it a visitor center that we're working on, and some exhibits within there for visitors when they come to the park.
Great. What about preservation at the battlefield? What has been the preservation process of protecting that battlefield land?
Yeah, it's the early 2000s is when it all started. It was meant to be really the whole parcel, the park that we have as we know it today, the 140 acres, was meant to be a housing subdivision. But preservation stepped in, most notably the Civil War Trust, Prince William County, and they were able to get the core area of the battlefield, or at least some of it, so that when you go there, you really do see the dynamic of Northern Virginia. There's this large open space of Bristow Station battlefield, and then literally butting right up against it is hundreds of homes, modern homes. But it is really a great preservation success story. It's not over. The Civil War Trust has just completed, American Battlefield Trust now has just completed the purchase of an additional 152 acres at Bristow Station that we're looking forward to managing sometime in the coming future, and that's going to be added to the park. So the preservation story is definitely far from over, and we also want to let folks know that the Bristow Station battlefield is not just these open preserved spaces. Where the Harris Teeter is on the north side of 28 is part of the battlefield. Confederate artillery positions there. Milford, where the Union 5th Corps was positioned and fired upon, is where the target is along 28. Union artillery positions are right next to the airport and the VRE station there at Bristow. So there's really a much larger footprint from the battlefield that we're trying to preserve just piece by piece as best as we can.
Wonderful. Yeah, actually, I have never been to Ben Lomond, but I have been to Bristow, and I was definitely, when I first approached it, I was kind of shocked because you do drive through this residential neighborhood, but once you're there, I found it very easy to kind of follow the actions that took place there. So highly recommend that anyone watching who hasn't been, please give them a visit.
Yeah, come check us out. We're always open, dawn to dusk.
So we have just a few minutes left. Anything else you want to add here, Kevin?
Yeah, we'll just say for our historic preservation division, I just manage 2 sites out in the Western County, but we have over a dozen sites that we do manage that range from Revolutionary War history, reconstruction. We have a one-room schoolhouse, the Lucasville School, that you can visit. And so there's just a wide array of history that we help to preserve and help share with the residents of Prince William County and visitors, of course, to Prince William County as well.
Great, thank you. And thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I think everybody really enjoyed the program. I know I did. If you guys want to enjoy more of Kevin's work, Kevin is an established author. I know you've written a few works on the 1862 Maryland campaign, the Battle of Antietam, the Battle of Shepherdstown. So please, I guess you can find more of your work at Emerging Civil War. I know you're a frequent contributor there. In normal times, I know you do the Civil War Roundtable circuit, so you're a frequent guest there. So people can find you. What's the best way for people to find you online if they have questions or if they're interested in your writing?
Probably Emerging Civil War. I would direct them to the website there, and they can get in touch with me personally from that.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much, Kevin, and thank you everyone for joining us at home. We hope you enjoyed yourselves. Again, we'll be back next Friday at 5 with another great program. Next week, we have Karen Hughes-White. She's with the Afro-American Historical Association in Fauquier County, and she's going to talk about some of the historic African-American communities there. As always, if you want to keep tabs on what's going on with the Mosby Heritage Area, you can follow us online. Our website, mosbyheritagearea.org. You can follow us on Facebook, and you can also sign up for our newsletter. We've been keeping a regular weekly newsletter with all of our online programming. So thank you all so much. Thank you, Kevin. It's been a real pleasure, and we'll see you again soon.